A good morning, students. Welcome back to the class Hereditary and Evolution. Today, we are going to move on to the next topic, that is speciation. We have seen so far is microevolution. That means the changes are small even though they are significant. Whatever may be the changes we have seen in the color variation of beetles, that is red beetles to green, or even blue beetles, or even the elephant star, and the other example, the tailless mice. All these examples are not so significant. They could not explain, that is the how the variation or the evolution has been taken place. Also, they simply changed the common characteristic of a particular species, but they could not explain properly, that is how new species came into existence. That can be said to have happened only if this group of beetles were thinking about splits into two populations that cannot reproduce with each other. When this happens, they can be called the two independent species. So, can we extend the reasoning we have used to explain such speciation? Yes. So, consider what would happen if the bushes of the beetle feed on the spread widely over a mountain range. The beetle population become a very large as a result, but individual beetles feed mostly on a few nearby bushes throughout their lifetime. Since they do not travel so far in this huge population of beetles, there will be subpopulation in our neighborhoods. Since male and female beetles have to meet for reproduction to happen, the most reproduction will be within the subpopulation itself. Since they will not move from one population to the other population, the reproduction will be taking place within the same species, so there is no variations can be seen. Of course, an occasional adventurous beetle might go from one side to the another side. As a beetle is picked up by a crow from one side and dropped onto the other side, would be eaten up without eating up. In either case, the migrate beetle will reproduce with the local population itself. This results in the gene of a migrate beetle entering a new population. This kind of gene flow is bound to happen between the population that are partly but not completely separated. If, however, between two such subpopulations a large river comes into existence, the populations will be further isolated. The levels of gene flow between them will decrease even further. Over generations, genetic drift will accumulate different changes in each subpopulation. Also, natural selection may also operate differently in these different geographic areas. Thus, for example, in the territory of one subpopulation, crows are eliminated by eagles, but this does not happen for the other subpopulation where crows' number are high. As a result, the green variations will not be selected as the first site, while it will be strongly selected at the second. Together, the process of genetic drift and natural selection will result in these two isolated subpopulations of beetles becoming more and more different from one another. Eventually, members of these groups will be incapable of reproducing with each other even if they happen to meet. There can be a number of ways by which this can happen. If DNA changes are severe enough, such a change in the number of chromosomes eventually the germ cells of the two groups cannot fuse with each other, or a new variation emerge in which green females will not mate with red males but only with green males. This allows very strong natural selection for greenness. Now, if such a green female beetles meet a red male from other group, her behavior will ensure that there is no reproduction between them. Effectively, new species of beetles are being generated. So, evolution and classification. Based on these principles, we can work out the evolutionary relationships of the basic we see around us. It is a short of going backwards in time. We have already seen the hierarchies of characteristics in our earlier classes. Similarities among organisms will allow us to group them and then to study the groups. Then, what do you mean by characteristics? Characteristics are details of appearance or behavior, in other words, a particular form of or a particular function. That we have four limbs is thus a characteristic. The plants do not or plants can do photosynthesis, whereas animals cannot do it is also a characteristic. Some basic characteristics will be shared by most organisms. The cell is a basic unit in all organisms. The characteristics is the next level of organism classification, would be shared by most but not all organisms. A basic characteristics of cell design that differs among different organisms is whether the cell has a nucleus. The bacterial cells do not have nucleus while the cells of most other organisms have, that is higher organisms. Among organisms with nucleated cells, which ones are unicellular and which ones are multicellular. That property marks a very basic difference in a body design because a specialization of a cell types and tissues. That's why we can say eukaryotes and prokaryotes plays a very important role in the body design of any other organisms. Among multicellular organisms, whether they can undertake photosynthesis or not will provide the next level of classification. Among the multicellular organisms that cannot do photosynthesis, whether the skeleton is inside the body or around the body will mark another fundamental design and difference. The more characteristics two species will have in common, the more closely they are related. And the more closely they are related, the more recently they have a common ancestor. For example, a brother and a sister, they are closely related because they have a first ancestor, that is their parents. But a girl and a first cousin, they are also related, but they don't have a common ancestor because their first this thing or ancestors, they are nothing but a grandparents in the second generation before them, not in the first one. We can now say or we can now tell that is the classification of species is in the fact a reflection of the evolutionary relationship. We can thus build up small groups of species with recent common ancestors, then supergroups of these groups with more distinct common ancestors, and so on. In theory, we can keep going backwards like this until we come to the notion of a single species at the very beginning of our evolutionary time. There are many theories about how this might have happened. It would be interesting too to come up with the theories of our own. So, tracing the evolutionary relationship. In this thing, we are going to learn about that is homologous organs and even heterologous organs. When we try to follow evolutionary relationship, how do we identify characteristics as common? The characteristics in different organisms would be similar because they are inherited from a common ancestors. As an example, consider the fact that mammals have four limbs, as do birds, reptiles, and amphibians. The basic structures of the limbs is similar, though it has been modified to perform different functions in a different vertebrate. For example, in mammals, what happens? We will be having hands, whereas in the birds, it has been modified into which one? That is for the flying, it will be helpful. So, different modifications which are taking place. Such a homologous characteristics help to identify an evolutionary relationship between apparently different species. However, all similarities simply in organ shape are not necessarily because of a common ancestry. What would we think about the wings of a bird and a bat? For example, bats and the birds have wings, but squirrels and lizards do not have. So, are birds and bats more closely related to each other than to squirrels or quills? Before we jump to this conclusion, let us look at the wings of the birds and bats more closely. When we do that, we find that the wings of a bat are skin folded stretchily mainly between elongated fingers, but the wings of a bird are a feathery covering all along the arms. The design of the two wings, their structure and components are thus very different. They look similar because they have a common use for which one, that is flying, but their origins are not in common. This makes them analogous characteristics rather than homologous characteristics. It would now be interesting to think about whether the bird's arms and bat arms would be considered homologous or analogous. So it is understood for us, that is, if the organism's organ which is common, or which is the origin of these organisms are same or same origin, then we are going to call it as which one, that is homologous organs. But if the origin is different, but if they are going to perform the same functions, then they are going to call it as which one, that is analogous organs.